Samuel Crawford thought he'd bought nothing but empty land and broken dreams for his last $47, until he pushed open the door of his ramshackle Nebraska ranch house and discovered a desperate young mother and her small son hiding in the shadows. When the corrupt land agent who sold them both the same property arrives with hired guns to claim the woman for human trafficking, Samuel must choose between the safety of solitude he'd always known and risking everything to protect the family he never knew he wanted. But will his decision to stand and fight cost them all their lives? The crack of Samuel Crawford's rifle echoed across the empty Nebraska plains as he brought down a jackrabbit for supper. But the shot also announced his arrival to anyone listening within 5 miles. October wind whipped dust devils around his horse's hooves as he approached the broken-down ranch house that now belonged to him, purchased with borrowed hope and his final $47 from 3 states away. Samuel's weathered hands shook slightly as he dismounted, not from the cold autumn air of 1867, but from the weight of this gamble. At 35, he carried the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from watching dreams crumble like old newspapers. The railroad bosses in Omaha had let him go when winter work dried up. His mining claim in the Black Hills had yielded nothing but blisters and broken promises. Now this ramshackle building squatted against the horizon, like his last chance at respectability. The house looked worse than the faded photograph the land agent had shown him back in Council Bluffs. Cedar shingles curled away from the walls like peeling skin. A front porch sagged under the weight of neglect, its railing missing several boards that lay scattered in the overgrown yard. Windows stared back at him with the hollow emptiness of a skull's eye sockets. Samuel pulled his worn leather satchel from the saddlebag and studied the deed one more time. The paper felt thin between his calloused fingers, but the words were clear enough. Samuel Crawford, sole owner of 160 acres and improvements thereon. The improvements looked like they needed their own improvements. He approached the front door, noting that someone had recently swept the porch steps clean of leaves and debris. Strange, considering the place was supposed to be abandoned. The brass key turned in the lock with surprising ease, too easy, as if the mechanism had been oiled recently rather than rusting from months of neglect. The door swung open with barely a creak. Sunlight streamed through grimy windows, revealing a front room that should have been thick with dust but wasn't. Sheet-covered furniture sat arranged as if someone had been living here, caring for the place. On the stone mantelpiece above a cold fireplace, a child's wooden horse sat next to a tin cup that still held water. Samuel's heart began beating faster. Fresh ashes lay scattered in the fireplace, and he could smell the lingering scent of cornbread in the air. Someone had been cooking here recently, maybe as recently as this morning. A floorboard groaned somewhere deeper in the house. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip, though he'd never drawn it on another person in his life. Railroad work and mining disputes had taught him to carry iron, but pulling a gun on a man was different from shooting rabbits for supper. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly from 3 days of riding without conversation. "I'm the new owner. I'm not looking for trouble." Silence stretched like a held breath. Then, from what must be the bedroom, came the soft sound of whispers. A woman's voice, urgent and afraid, and something else. Something that made Samuel's chest tighten with unexpected recognition. A child's voice, asking questions in the way small children do when the world suddenly becomes confusing. Samuel moved deeper into the house, his boots announcing each step against the wooden floor. The kitchen revealed more signs of recent occupation. A child's cup beside the wash basin, still damp from washing. Plates stacked neatly on a shelf, as if someone had been maintaining a proper household, despite having no legal right to be there. On the rough wooden table sat a loaf of bread covered with a clean cloth. The bread was still soft when Samuel pressed it gently with one finger. "I know someone's here," he said, trying to make his voice sound less threatening. "I'm not the law, and I'm not looking to hurt anybody. Just want to understand what's happening in my house." The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by the kind of silence that screams with tension. Samuel waited, letting whoever was hiding decide whether to trust him or not. He'd been on both ends of desperation enough times to recognize the signs. A door opened slowly in the back of the house, hinges squeaking like mice. A woman emerged from the shadows of what must be the bedroom, clutching a small boy against her chest like a shield. She couldn't have been more than 25, with auburn hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and green eyes that held the wariness of a cornered animal. The child, perhaps 3 years old, peered at Samuel over his mother's shoulder with curious blue eyes that reminded Samuel painfully of his own nephew, back in Missouri, the boy he'd never see again, after his brother's farm failed and the family scattered to the winds. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice carrying the musical lilt of Ireland in its cadence. "Please, don't turn us in to the sheriff. We have nowhere else to go." Samuel lowered his hand from his weapon, studying the pair. The woman's dress was clean, but patched in several places with different colored fabric, each repair done with careful precision. The boy's clothes were too small for his growing frame, but they'd been washed and mended with obvious care. Behind them, through the open bedroom door, Samuel could see 2 bedding rolls and a few meager possessions, arranged with the kind of neat organization that spoke of people trying to maintain dignity in desperate circumstances. "Turn you in?" Samuel repeated, confusion evident in his voice. "Ma'am, I just bought this place from Jeremiah Mosley 3 days ago. I had no idea anyone was living here." The woman's grip on the child tightened, her knuckles showing white against her sun-darkened hands. "You're the new owner?" "But Mr. Mosley said the man who owned this place lived back east and would never come west to see it. He said I could stay here as long as I kept the place maintained and didn't cause any trouble." "Mosley told you that?" Samuel's jaw tightened as pieces of a larger picture began forming in his mind. The land agent in Council Bluffs had assured him the property was completely empty, ready for immediate occupation. "Ma'am, I think we might both have been played for fools by the same man." The boy squirmed in his mother's arms, wanting to get down and explore, but she held him close. Samuel could see the exhaustion in her posture, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from months of uncertainty and fear. "What's your name?" Samuel asked gently. "Constance Murphy," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "This is my son Daniel. My husband died of the fever last spring, and we had nothing left in Missouri. I thought if I came west, I might find work, maybe make a life for us." Samuel nodded slowly, recognizing the familiar story of loss and displacement that had driven so many people onto the frontier. "How long have you been here, Mrs. Murphy?" 3 months, she admitted. "Mr. Mosley said I was doing him a favor, keeping the place from falling apart while the owner was away. He said if I proved myself useful, there might be permanent work when the owner finally showed up." Samuel walked to the window and stared out at the prairie grass bending under the October wind. 3 months she'd been maintaining his property. 3 months he'd been paying taxes on land that Mosley was apparently using as free housing for displaced families, probably collecting rent from multiple sources for the same property. "That snake," Samuel muttered under his breath. "Sir?" Constance's voice was barely audible. Samuel turned back to face her, seeing the fear she was trying to hide for her son's sake. Daniel had finally convinced his mother to put him down, and was now examining Samuel with the frank curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to be afraid of strangers. "Mrs. Murphy, can you cook?" Samuel asked suddenly. The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Yes, sir. I can cook and clean and tend a garden. I can mend clothes and preserve food for winter. I'm not afraid of hard work." Samuel looked around the house again, noting details he'd missed in his initial shock at finding occupants. The floors had been swept clean. The windows, though grimy from the outside, were spotless on the interior. Someone had even arranged wildflowers in a cracked vase on the kitchen table, bringing a touch of beauty to the rough surroundings. "Can you handle a rifle?" he asked. Constance blinked in surprise. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12, said a woman on the frontier needed to know how to protect herself. Good, Samuel said, though he wasn't entirely sure why he was asking these questions. The practical part of his mind was already calculating. He needed someone to maintain the property while he worked on improvements, and she needed a place to live. It could be a mutually beneficial arrangement. The emotional part of his mind, the part he usually tried to keep locked away, was responding to something else entirely. The way she held her son with fierce protectiveness, the pride in her voice when she listed her skills, the careful way she'd maintained his house, even though she had no legal right to be there. "Mrs. Murphy," Samuel said finally, "I propose we make the best of this situation that Moseley has created for both of us." Hope flickered in her green eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this house is big enough for 3 people, at least temporarily. I need help getting this place running properly, and you need somewhere to live. Seems to me we could help each other out while we figure out what to do about our mutual problem with Jeremiah Moseley." Relief flooded Constance's features, like sunrise after a long night. For the first time since Samuel had entered the house, she allowed herself to smile, an expression that transformed her entire face and made Samuel's heart skip in a way he hadn't experienced since his youth. "You'd let us stay?" she whispered. "I'd be honored to have you stay," Samuel replied, surprising himself with the honesty in his voice. Daniel chose that moment to approach Samuel directly, looking up at him with those serious blue eyes. "Are you going to live here too?" the boy asked. Samuel crouched down to the child's level, remembering how it felt to be small in a world of uncertain adults. "If that's all right with you, son." Daniel considered this gravely for a moment, then nodded. "Mama makes good biscuits," he offered as if sharing a valuable secret. Samuel laughed, actually laughed for the first time in months. "Well then, I guess we'd better make sure she has everything she needs to keep making them." Outside, the wind was picking up, and Samuel could see dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Weather was changing, and he suspected their lives were about to change just as dramatically. The storm hit 2 hours after sunset, with the fury of a wild animal, sending sheets of rain against the windows and rattling the old house like dice in a cup. Samuel had insisted on taking the small side room off the kitchen, leaving Constance and Daniel the larger bedroom where they'd been staying. Now he lay awake on his bedroll, listening to the wind howl around the eaves and the soft murmur of Constance singing her son to sleep in the next room. Lightning flashed, illuminating his unfamiliar surroundings in stark black and white. The room was barely large enough for a single bed, but it was warm and dry, more comfort than he'd known in recent months. Through the thin wall, he could hear Daniel asking questions in the sleepy way of children fighting off bedtime. "Will the new man stay, Mama?" "I don't know, sweetheart. We'll see what tomorrow brings. I like him. He has kind eyes." Samuel found himself smiling in the darkness. When was the last time anyone had called his eyes kind? Railroad foremen had called them determined. Mining supervisors had called them desperate. But kind? That was something new. The singing resumed. An Irish lullaby about sailing ships and distant shores that made Samuel think of his own mother, dead these past 15 years. He'd forgotten that homes could sound like this, filled with gentle voices and the rustle of someone caring for someone else. Thunder crashed overhead, and Samuel felt the house shudder around him. This old place had weathered many storms, but how many more could it survive? The roof would need repairs before winter settled in for good. The foundation had gaps that let cold air seep through the floorboards. The whole structure needed attention that would cost money he didn't have. But for the first time since arriving in Nebraska, Samuel felt something other than despair. Maybe it was the warm meal Constance had prepared from his jackrabbit and vegetables from her hidden garden behind the house. Maybe it was the way Daniel had chattered through dinner about the creatures he'd seen in the prairie grass, rabbits and ground squirrels, and once a family of foxes that came to drink from the well at dawn. Or maybe it was simply the realization that he wasn't alone anymore. Morning brought clear skies and the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast. Samuel was splitting firewood behind the house, working up a sweat despite the cool air, when he heard riders coming from the direction of town. 3 horses, moving with purpose rather than casual travel. Constance. He called quietly through the back door. Take Daniel inside and stay there until I say otherwise. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed, but moved around to the front of the house, his hand resting on the grip of his Colt. The riders were still a quarter mile away, but Samuel could already make out the lead figure. A thin man in an expensive coat, sitting his horse like someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. Jeremiah Mosley. The land agent had 2 companions, both carrying rifles across their saddles, with the casual familiarity of men who knew how to use them. They weren't wearing badges, which meant they weren't law officers. Private muscle then, the kind of men who asked questions with their fists and settled disputes with lead. Samuel checked his revolver, making sure the cylinder turned smoothly. 6 shots, if it came to that. He hoped it wouldn't, but hope was a luxury he'd learned not to depend on too heavily. Mosley reined in his horse, 20 feet from the front porch. Close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid any sudden moves Samuel might make. The land agent was younger than Samuel had expected, maybe 40, with the kind of soft hands that had never known real work. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his mustache was waxed to sharp points that twitched when he smiled. Mr. Crawford, Mosley said, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a man who sold things people didn't need. I trust you found your property satisfactory? Depends on how you define satisfactory, Samuel replied evenly. Found some unexpected residents. Mosley's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his pale blue eyes. Ah, yes, Mrs. Murphy and her boy. Tragic case, really. The woman's been trespassing on your land for months. I've been trying to convince her to move on, but she's proven quite stubborn. Through the front window, Samuel caught a glimpse of Constance's face, pale but determined. Daniel pressed against her skirts, his small hands clutching the fabric as he sensed the tension in the air. Funny thing about that, Samuel said, keeping his voice casual. She tells me you gave her permission to stay here. Said she was doing you a favor by maintaining the place. One of Mosley's companions, a bearded man with scars on his knuckles, shifted in his saddle. His rifle moved slightly, not quite pointing at Samuel but ready to be raised quickly if needed. I'm afraid the poor woman misunderstood our conversation, Mosley said smoothly. Grief can cloud a person's judgment, as I'm sure you understand. The fact remains that she's been living on your property without permission, consuming resources that rightfully belong to you. What resources would those be? Samuel asked. Well, there's the matter of firewood she's burned, food from the root cellar, wear and tear on the building itself. I calculate she owes at least $50 in damages. Samuel almost laughed. The root cellar had been empty when he'd checked it that morning, and there wasn't $50 worth of anything on this entire property except the land itself. That's a considerable sum, Samuel said. What happens if she can't pay? Mosley's smile widened, showing teeth that were too white and too sharp. Fortunately, I have connections in Omaha. There are establishments there that are always looking for attractive young women willing to work off their debts. And the boy? Well, there are families who need strong backs for farm work. Arrangements can be made. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He'd heard whispers of such operations in railroad camps and mining towns, places where desperate people disappeared into systems that ground them up and spat out nothing but profit for men like Mosley. Over my dead body, Samuel said quietly. The bearded man's rifle rose slightly. That can be arranged, he said in a voice like gravel. Now, Mosley said, raising a hand to calm his companion. Let's not be hasty. Mr. Crawford, you seem like a reasonable man. Surely we can work out an accommodation that benefits everyone. I'm listening, Samuel said, though every muscle in his body was coiled for action. The way I see it, you have 2 choices. You can pay the woman's debt yourself, $50, as I mentioned, and she can work off the amount through court services to be determined. Or you can step aside and let me handle this unfortunate situation in my own way. Samuel felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler. And if I choose a third option? What third option would that be? The one where I tell you to get off my property and take your hired guns with you. Mosley's companion raised his rifle fully now, the barrel pointing directly at Samuel's chest. Mister, you're outnumbered and outgunned. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. But even as the words left the man's mouth, Samuel heard something that made his heart leap. The distant thunder of more hoofbeats, approaching fast from the direction of the Weber farm. Yesterday, while Constance had prepared breakfast, Samuel had taken a walk to introduce himself to his nearest neighbor, an old German immigrant named Klaus Weber, who ran cattle on the section adjacent to Samuel's land. Klaus had listened to Samuel's story about Mosley with the kind of grim attention that suggested he'd heard similar tales before. That man, Klaus had said in his heavily accented English, he is like a disease that spreads from farm to farm, taking what does not belong to him. Samuel had asked Klaus to keep an eye on the Crawford place and to fetch the sheriff if he saw any signs of trouble. Now, as dust clouds rose on the horizon behind Mosley's men, Samuel allowed himself a small smile. Gentlemen, he said, I believe you're about to be outnumbered yourselves. Mosley spun in his saddle, cursing when he saw the approaching riders. Sheriff Hawkins rode in the lead, his badge glinting in the morning sun, flanked by 2 deputies and Klaus Weber himself. The old German's weathered face showed grim satisfaction as he pointed toward Mosley's group. Sheriff Hawkins, Mosley called out, trying to regain his composure. Perfect timing. I was just explaining to Mr. Crawford here about the trespassing situation on his property. Sheriff Hawkins was a barrel-chested man in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the kind of steady eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize trouble when it wore expensive clothes. He reined in his horse and studied the scene with the careful attention of a professional lawman. That's interesting, Mosley, the sheriff said in a voice that carried the authority of 20 years, keeping peace on the frontier. Because Klaus here brought me some mighty interesting documents from your office this morning. Seems your filing clerk developed a case of conscience and thought the law should see your duplicate ledgers. The color drained from Mosley's face. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm talking about fraud, Sheriff Hawkins said bluntly, collecting rent from multiple parties for the same properties, falsifying ownership documents, and according to some other complaints I've received, involvement in human trafficking. Samuel felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Mosley hadn't just been running a simple rental scam, he'd been operating a larger criminal enterprise that preyed on desperate people like Constance and himself. This is preposterous, Mosley protested, but his voice had lost its commanding tone. These are all misunderstandings that can be cleared up. The only thing that's going to be cleared up, Sheriff Hawkins said as he dismounted, is whether you prefer to come quietly or make this difficult. Mosley's hired men looked at each other, clearly calculating whether their loyalty was worth risking a fight with legitimate law officers. The bearded man slowly lowered his rifle. Sheriff, he said, we were just hired to ride along. Didn't know nothing about any fraud or trafficking. Smart man, Sheriff Hawkins replied. You boys can ride on out of here, but stay in the territory until this gets sorted out. We might have questions for you later. As the 2 gunmen spurred their horses toward town, Mosley made one final desperate play. You think you've accomplished something here, Crawford, he snarled, his cultivated facade finally cracking completely. That woman has debts all over Missouri. Creditors will come looking for her. And when they do, you'll wish you'd minded your own business. Samuel stepped closer, no longer caring about the threat Mosley represented. When they come, he said quietly, they'll find that Mrs. Murphy is under the protection of her husband. The words surprised everyone present, including Samuel himself. Through the window, he could see Constance staring at him with wide eyes, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. What are you saying? She whispered, though the question was barely audible through the glass. Samuel turned to look at her directly, his heart pounding with the magnitude of what he was proposing. I'm saying that if you'll have me, Constance Murphy, I'd be honored to marry you and call Daniel my son." Sheriff Hawkins chuckled as he secured handcuffs around Mosley's wrists. Well, that's one way to solve a legal problem. But Samuel wasn't thinking about legal solutions anymore. He was thinking about the way Constance had maintained his house with careful pride, the way she'd sung her son to sleep, the way she'd offered to cook and clean and work hard rather than accept charity. Most of all, he was thinking about the moment when Daniel had looked up at him with those serious blue eyes and declared that he had kind eyes. Maybe, Samuel thought, as Constance slowly opened the front door, kindness was exactly what this broken-down ranch needed to become a home. The wedding dress hung like a ghost in the corner of Constance's bedroom, its simple blue fabric catching the morning light that streamed through windows she'd cleaned until they sparkled. 3 weeks had passed since Samuel's unexpected proposal, and today, November 15th, 1867, would either be the beginning of everything she'd dreamed of or the biggest mistake of her life. Constance's hands trembled as she buttoned the dress Samuel had purchased from the general store in town. The fabric was store-bought cotton, not the fine silk she'd once imagined for her wedding day, but it felt more precious than any gown because it represented hope rather than obligation. Through the thin walls, she could hear Samuel teaching Daniel how to tie his new shoes, their voices mixing with the sound of Klaus Weber arriving with a wagon full of mysterious bundles. "Mama, are you scared?" Daniel asked from the doorway, his small frame nearly swallowed by his first real suit. Samuel had insisted on buying the boy proper clothes for the ceremony, saying every young man needed to look his best when his mother got married. Constance knelt to straighten Daniel's collar, using the action to hide her own uncertainty. "A little," she admitted. "Sometimes the best things in life are a little scary. Papa Samuel says, being scared means you care about something important." Papa Samuel. Daniel had started using the name naturally 3 days ago, as if he'd been waiting his whole short life for the right person to claim it. The ease with which her son had accepted Samuel into their small family both amazed and worried. Constance, what if this arrangement didn't work? What if Samuel changed his mind once the legal protection of marriage had served its purpose? "Mrs. Murphy?" Sheriff Hawkins' voice called from the front room. "The preacher's ready when you are." Constance took one last look in the cracked mirror that had come with the house. The woman staring back at her looked older than her 24 years, marked by loss and hardship, but there was something new in her green eyes, a spark of possibility that hadn't been there since her first husband's death. She opened the bedroom door to find Samuel waiting in the front room, dressed in a black suit that must have cost him nearly everything he had left. His dark hair was slicked back, and he'd shaved carefully, but it was his expression that made her breath catch. He looked at her as if she were something precious, rather than a burden he'd agreed to shoulder. "You look beautiful," he said simply, and she believed him because his voice carried no false flattery, only honest appreciation. Pastor Mueller from the Lutheran Church stood beside the fireplace, his round face beaming with the joy of a man who genuinely loved presiding over new beginnings. Klaus Weber had positioned himself near the kitchen, trying to look stern but failing to hide his satisfaction at the morning's events. Sheriff Hawkins served as their witness, his presence ensuring that no legal challenges could arise from their hasty arrangement. But it was Daniel who stole the moment. Stepping forward with a small bouquet of prairie flowers he'd picked that morning, despite the November frost. "For you, Mama," he said solemnly, presenting the wilted blooms as if they were roses from the finest garden. Constance felt tears threaten as she accepted the flowers. This wasn't the wedding she'd imagined as a young girl in County Cork, with hundreds of guests and endless celebration. But as she looked around the small room at these people who'd become her chosen family, she realized it was something better. It was real. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Mueller began, his German accent lending gravity to the familiar words. "We are gathered here today to join Samuel Crawford and Constance Murphy in holy matrimony." The vows were simple, spoken in voices that carried across the small room like promises made to the wind. Samuel's hands were steady as he slipped a plain gold band onto Constance's finger. Another purchase that must have cost him dearly. When her turn came to speak the words that would bind their lives together, Constance found herself meaning them more than she'd expected. I, Constance, take you, Samuel, to be my husband, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, till death do us part. You may kiss the bride, Pastor Mueller announced, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Samuel's kiss was gentle, respectful, the kiss of a man who understood that trust had to be earned rather than claimed. When they separated, Constance saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip, not passion exactly, but the promise of it, the suggestion that this arrangement might grow into something neither of them had dared to expect. Klaus Weber had mysteriously produced a feast that seemed to materialize from the wagon he'd brought, complete with German sausages, fresh bread, and a bottle of whiskey that Sheriff Hawkins declared was for medicinal purposes only. Daniel sat between his new parents, chattering excitedly about everything he wanted to show Papa Samuel around his ranch. As afternoon faded into evening and their guests prepared to leave, Constance found herself alone with Samuel for the first time as his wife. The weight of that reality settled around them like a heavy blanket, bringing both comfort and uncertainty. I've been thinking, Samuel said as they watched Daniel play with the wooden toys Klaus had brought as a wedding gift. About what comes next, I mean. Constance felt her stomach tighten. Second thoughts already? Not about marrying you, Samuel said quickly. About how we make this work. This ranch. This life we're building. He moved to the window, staring out at the prairie that stretched endlessly in all directions. I've been failing at things for so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have something worth protecting. You haven't failed at anything, Constance protested. You saved us. Samuel turned back to her, his expression serious. We saved each other, but saving is just the beginning. Now we have to figure out how to build something that lasts. The conversation that followed lasted well into the night. Two strangers who'd become spouses discussing dreams and fears with the careful honesty of people who understood that their survival depended on working together. They talked about expanding the small garden behind the house, about maybe adding some chickens come spring, about the roof repairs that couldn't wait much longer. But underneath the practical planning lay deeper questions neither was quite ready to voice. Could a marriage based on necessity grow into something more? Could two damaged people create the kind of home that children thrived in? Could they learn to trust each other with the fragile hopes they'd both kept hidden? Outside, winter wind rattled the windows with increasing force, as if nature itself was testing the strength of their shelter. Inside, by the warmth of the fire Samuel had built, they began the delicate work of weaving their separate lives into something new. The arrangement of sleeping quarters remained unchanged. Samuel in the small side room, Constance and Daniel in the main bedroom. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between them. They were no longer strangers sharing a house out of desperation. They were a family, bound by law and choice, and the growing conviction that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. When Constance finally said goodnight and disappeared into her room with Daniel, Samuel sat alone by the dying fire, staring at the simple gold band on his own finger. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a failed prospector with $47 and no future. Tonight, he was a husband and father, with responsibilities that both terrified and exhilarated him. Through the bedroom wall, he could hear Constance singing Daniel to sleep the same Irish lullaby that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. But tonight, the melody seemed to carry new meaning, as if she were singing not just to her son, but to the possibility of tomorrow. Samuel smiled in the darkness, thinking that maybe this broken-down ranch house was becoming exactly what it had always been meant to be, a home where lost souls could find their way back to hope. Winter came early that year, arriving with a vengeance that tested every nail and board in the old house. By December, Samuel and Constance had settled into a rhythm of cooperation that surprised them both with its naturalness. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, while he worked on improvements that would help them survive the harsh Nebraska cold. The morning routine began before dawn, with Samuel building up the fire while Constance prepared breakfast. Daniel would emerge from the bedroom like a small whirlwind, chattering about his dreams and plans for the day. They ate together at the kitchen table Samuel had reinforced, discussing the work that needed doing and the supplies they'd need for winter. The conversations flowed more easily now, seasoned with shared jokes and the comfortable silences of people who no longer felt the need to fill every moment with words. Samuel discovered that Constance had a sharp wit hidden beneath her careful politeness, while she learned that his gruff exterior concealed a man who worried constantly about providing for his new family. "The Weber boy stopped by yesterday while you were in town," Constance mentioned over breakfast, one snowy morning in mid-December. "Said his father wants to talk to you about something important." Samuel looked up from his coffee, noting the slight tension in her voice. "Did he say what about?" "No, but he seemed excited. Kept saying it was good news." Daniel piped up from his seat between them, syrup from his pancakes decorating his chin. "He said there might be treasure buried somewhere around here." Samuel and Constance exchanged glances. "Treasure?" Samuel asked carefully. "That's what he said," Daniel confirmed with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old. "Maybe gold coins, like in the stories Mama tells me." Constance ruffled her son's hair affectionately. "I think young Friedrich may have an active imagination." But Samuel was remembering something Klaus had mentioned weeks ago, something about the previous owner of this land, and why the property had been abandoned for so long. He'd been too focused on immediate survival to pursue the conversation, but now curiosity gnawed at him. "I'll ride over to the Weber place after I finish mending that section of fence," Samuel decided. Might as well find out what has Klaus so worked up. The ride to the neighboring ranch gave Samuel time to think about how much his life had changed in just 2 months. The horse beneath him was the same tired mare he'd ridden into Nebraska, but everything else was different. He had a wife now, a son, responsibilities that extended beyond his own survival. The thought should have terrified him, it would have, back in October. Instead, he found himself planning improvements for the spring, imagining Daniel old enough to help with the chores, wondering if Constance might be willing to expand their family further someday. Klaus Weber's farm was a testament to 15 years of hard work and careful planning. The barn was solid and well-maintained. The house showed evidence of recent improvements, and smoke rose from the chimney in a steady stream that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Klaus himself emerged from the barn as Samuel approached, his weathered face breaking into the kind of smile that suggested good news was indeed forthcoming. "Samuel, my friend," Klaus called out in his heavily accented English. "Perfect timing. Come inside. Anna has coffee ready, and we have much to discuss." Anna Weber, a plump woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, bustled around their warm kitchen, while Klaus pulled out a worn leather folder stuffed with papers. The contrast between their comfortable home and Samuel's own barely adequate shelter was stark, but Klaus seemed oblivious to any disparity. "You remember I told you about Johann Brenner, the man who owned your land before Mosley got his hands on it?" Klaus began, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Samuel nodded. He recalled Klaus mentioning that the previous owner had died suddenly, leaving the property in legal limbo that Mosley had somehow exploited. "Well, Johann was a friend of mine. Came west same time I did. Good man, hard worker, but he had one weakness. He trusted people too easily." Klaus's expression darkened, including Jeremiah Mosley. Anna set mugs of coffee before them, her presence a comfortable domestic backdrop to Klaus's story. Samuel wrapped his hands around the warm cup, grateful for the heat in the unheated barn where they'd been working. Johann hired Mosley to handle his legal affairs when he got sick, Klaus continued. Property transfers, will preparation, that sort of thing. But when Johann died, Mosley claimed the land had been deeded to him for payment of debts. "Claimed," Samuel repeated. Klaus nodded grimly. Johann's nephew in St. Louis finally got suspicious when he didn't receive the inheritance Johann had promised him. hired a lawyer to investigate, and what they found was interesting indeed. The German farmer pulled a thick document from his folder, smoothing it carefully on the table. This is Johann's real will, the one he filed with the county clerk before he got sick. In it, he leaves his land to his nephew, but with a very specific provision. Samuel leaned forward, studying the handwritten document. The legal language was complicated, but one section was marked with heavy ink strokes, as if someone had wanted to draw attention to it. What kind of provision? Klaus smiled, the expression of a man about to deliver news that would change everything. If the nephew cannot claim the land within 5 years of Johann's death, it goes to whoever is actually living on and improving the property at that time. Johann believed land should belong to the people who work it, not speculators who buy and sell it like commodities. Samuel felt his heart begin to race. When did Johann die? 3 years ago this spring, Klaus replied. Which means whoever is living on that land when the 5-year period expires will own it free and clear, regardless of what Mosley's fraudulent documents claim. The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. If he could prove continuous occupation and improvement of the property for the remaining 2 years, the ranch would belong to him and his family permanently. No more payments to Mosley, no more fear of eviction, no more uncertainty about their future. But there's more, Klaus continued, his eyes twinkling with barely contained excitement. Johann was convinced that the original homesteader who claimed this land back in the 1850s had found something valuable. Gold, maybe, or silver. The man disappeared suddenly one winter, and Johann spent years looking for whatever it was that made him abandon a perfectly good claim. Daniel's excited chatter about treasure suddenly seemed less like childish imagination and more like a possibility worth investigating. Samuel thought about the odd placement of certain buildings on his property, the inexplicable stone markers he'd noticed in the prairie grass. The reason why someone would choose that particular location for a homestead when better land was available nearby. Did Johann ever find anything? Samuel asked. Klaus shrugged. He found signs, places where someone had dug, tools hidden in unusual places, maps that didn't quite make sense, but he died before he could piece it all together. Anna Weber, who had been listening silently while she kneaded bread dough, finally spoke up. Klaus, show him the other thing. Klaus hesitated, then reached into the folder again. This time, he pulled out a hand-drawn map, yellowed with age and marked with symbols that meant nothing to Samuel. Johann found this hidden in the wall of your house when he was doing repairs, Klaus explained. Behind a loose board in what is now your bedroom. He spent 3 years trying to understand what it meant. Samuel studied the crude map, noting landmarks he recognized. The distinctive rock formation a mile north of his house, the bend in the creek that marked his eastern property line, the old cottonwood tree that stood sentinel near the well. But it was the X marked in red ink near the center of the map that made his breath catch. The X was positioned exactly where his house now stood, as if whoever had drawn the map had wanted to mark that specific location for future reference. Klaus, Samuel said slowly, are you telling me there might be treasure buried under my house? The German farmer grinned. I'm telling you that Johann Brenner spent his last 3 years convinced there was something valuable hidden on that property. And now you have 2 years to find it, or at least to prove you deserve to own the land where it's buried. Samuel rode home through the gathering dusk, with his mind spinning. The map was folded carefully in his coat pocket, along with copies of the legal documents Klaus had shared. The weight of possibility sat heavy on his shoulders, mixed with the fear that hope might once again prove to be a cruel joke. But as he approached his house, his home, and saw the warm light spilling from the windows onto the snow-covered yard, Samuel realized that he'd already found the most valuable treasure of all. Whatever might be buried beneath the floorboards was nothing compared to the family waiting for him inside. Still, as he put his horse away and headed for the door where Constance stood silhouetted against the lamplight, Samuel couldn't help but wonder what secrets the old house might be keeping and whether those secrets might finally give his family the security they deserve. The morning of December 23rd dawned gray and bitter, with wind that cut through the walls of the house like knives through paper. Samuel stood in the kitchen, holding the mysterious map and studying the floorboards beneath his feet with new eyes. 3 days had passed since his conversation with Klaus Weber, and he hadn't yet found the courage to tell Constance about the possibility of treasure hidden somewhere on their property. "You're acting strange," Constance observed from where she stood, kneading bread dough at the table. Her green eyes held the sharp awareness of a woman who'd learned to read danger in men's faces. "Ever since you came back from the Weber place, you've been walking around like you're afraid the floor might collapse." Daniel looked up from where he was playing with his wooden blocks near the fireplace. "Papa Samuel, are you looking for the treasure?" Samuel's head snapped toward his stepson. "What did you say?" "The treasure," Daniel repeated matter-of-factly. "Friedrich Weber told me his papa thinks there's treasure buried under our house. Is that why you keep staring at the floor?" Constance's hands stilled in the bread dough. "Samuel? What is he talking about?" There was no avoiding it now. Samuel pulled the folded map from his pocket and spread it carefully on the table, explaining Klaus's theory about Johann Brenner and the mysterious disappearance of the original homestead. As he spoke, he watched Constance's expression shift from curiosity to skepticism to something that might have been hope. "So you think there's actually something buried here?" she asked when he finished. "I think Johann Brenner thought there was something here," Samuel replied carefully. "Whether he was right or not is another question entirely." Constance studied the map, tracing the landmarks with her finger. "This X is marked right where our bedroom is located." "I noticed that too," Samuel admitted. "Which means if we're going to investigate, we'll need to move some furniture and pull up floorboards." "In the middle of winter?" Constance's practical nature asserted itself. "Samuel, if we start tearing apart the house now, we'll freeze to death before we find anything." She was right, of course, but the knowledge that something might be hidden beneath their feet was like a constant itch Samuel couldn't scratch. Every creak of the floorboards made him wonder. Every time he walked across the bedroom, he found himself studying the planks for signs of disturbance. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his brooding. Through the front window, Samuel could see a group of riders approaching through the snow, 4 men on horseback, moving with the purposeful pace of people on official business. "More visitors," Constance murmured, unconsciously moving closer to Daniel. Samuel checked his revolver and stepped onto the front porch, noting that these weren't the same kind of hired thugs Mosley had brought weeks earlier. These men wore badges and carried themselves with the authority of legitimate law enforcement. The lead rider was Sheriff Hawkins, but Samuel didn't recognize the other 3. One wore the uniform of a federal marshal, while the other 2 were dressed in the kind of expensive clothes that suggested wealth and education. "Morning, Samuel," Sheriff Hawkins called out as he dismounted. "Sorry to bother you folks so close to Christmas, but we've got some official business to discuss." The federal marshal stepped forward, a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Crawford, I'm Marshal Davidson from the Territorial Office in Omaha. These gentlemen are lawyers representing the estate of Johann Brenner." Samuel felt his stomach drop. Had someone discovered Klaus's plan to help him claim the property? Was this visit connected to the map he'd shown Constance just minutes earlier? "What can I do for you, Marshal?" Samuel asked, keeping his voice steady. One of the lawyers, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "Mr. Crawford, we're here to inform you that there are competing claims to this property. The estate of Johann Brenner has filed suit to recover land they claim was fraudulently transferred to Jeremiah Mosley." "We understand you purchased the property in good faith," the other lawyer added quickly. "But until the legal issues are resolved, there may be questions about your ownership rights." Samuel felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, the same sensation he'd experienced in mine collapses and railroad accidents. Just when he'd started to believe in the possibility of a secure future, the law was threatening to snatch it away. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked. Marshal Davidson consulted a document. It means that until the courts sort out the legitimate ownership of this land, you may be required to vacate the property or post a substantial bond to guarantee compensation if the estate's claim is upheld. How substantial? Samuel's voice was barely above a whisper. $500, the marshal replied, to be posted within 30 days. The number hit Samuel like a physical blow. $500 might as well have been $5,000. It was more money than he'd see in 2 years of farming, even if every crop succeeded perfectly. Behind him, Samuel heard the front door open. Constance stepped onto the porch with Daniel beside her, her chin raised in the defiant way that meant she was prepared to fight for her family. "Gentlemen," she said with icy politeness, "perhaps you'd like to explain why you're threatening to evict a family 3 days before Christmas." The lawyer with spectacles had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Ma'am, we're not threatening anyone. We're simply following legal procedures to resolve a property dispute." "Legal procedures that would put a woman and child out in the snow," Constance replied. "How very civilized of you." Marshal Davidson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Crawford, we understand this is difficult timing. The court is willing to extend the deadline until spring if Mr. Crawford can demonstrate good faith efforts to resolve the matter." "What kind of good faith efforts?" Samuel asked. "Payment of back taxes on the property, evidence of improvements made to the land, testimony from neighbors about your character and intentions." The marshal explained. "Anything that shows you're not simply a squatter or speculator." Sheriff Hawkins, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Marshal, these folks have been improving this property since they arrived. Samuel here married Mrs. Murphy to provide protection for her and her boy when Mosley tried to run his trafficking scheme on them." "That's commendable," the first lawyer said. "But it doesn't resolve the fundamental question of land ownership." Samuel felt rage building in his chest, the same fury that had sustained him through years of disappointment and betrayal. These men in their expensive clothes had ridden out from their warm offices to destroy his family's future, as casually as they might discuss the weather. "What if we could prove Johann Brenner intended for the land to go to whoever was actually living on and improving it?" Samuel asked suddenly. The lawyers exchanged glances. "That would depend on the nature of the proof," the one with spectacles replied carefully. Samuel made a decision that would either save his family or destroy them completely. "Then I suggest we step inside where it's warm and discuss what kind of proof you'd find acceptable." The next hour was the longest of Samuel's life. Seated around his kitchen table with lawyers and lawmen, he explained Klaus Weber's discoveries about Johann Brenner's real will and the 5-year provision for adverse possession. He showed them the map, described the evidence of previous treasure hunting, and argued that Brenner had clearly intended the land to go to working families rather than speculators. The lawyers listened with professional detachment, occasionally asking pointed questions about dates and documentation. Marshal Davidson took notes in a leather-bound journal, his expression revealing nothing. Finally, the lawyer with spectacles leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Crawford, what you're describing is certainly interesting, but it doesn't change the immediate legal situation. The estate's claim is based on documented fraud by Jeremiah Mosley, and that fraud affects your title, regardless of Johann Brenner's intentions." "However," the other lawyer interjected, "if you could demonstrate that you've discovered whatever it was Brenner was looking for on this property, that might constitute the kind of adverse possession improvement that would strengthen your claim significantly." Samuel felt his heart skip. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the lawyer said slowly, "that if Johann Brenner believed there was something valuable hidden here, and you actually found it, that would prove you've made the kind of substantial improvement to the property that adverse possession laws are designed to protect." "You're suggesting we dig up our house in the middle of winter?" Constance asked incredulously. Marshal Davidson smiled for the first time since arriving. "Ma'am, I'm suggesting that if you're going to dig up your house anyway, it might be wise to have official witnesses present to document whatever you find." The implications hung in the air, like smoke from the fire. These men weren't just here to deliver legal threats. They were offering Samuel a chance to gamble everything on the possibility that Johann Brenner's obsession with hidden treasure was more than the fantasy of a lonely old man. "And if we don't find anything?" Samuel asked. "Then you'll have 30 days to post the bond or vacate the property," Marshal Davidson replied. "Same as before." Samuel looked at Constance, seeing his own desperate hope reflected in her green eyes. They'd already lost everything once. Maybe it was time to risk everything on the chance of winning it all back. "How long would you gentlemen be willing to stay?" Samuel asked. "As long as it takes," the marshal replied. "One way or another, we'll have our answer before we leave." Outside, snow continued to fall, with the relentless persistence of Nebraska winter. Inside, Samuel Crawford prepared to bet his family's future on a treasure map drawn by a dead man, and the conviction that sometimes the biggest risks were the only ones worth taking. "Daniel," Samuel said to his stepson, who had been listening to the adult conversation with wide-eyed fascination, "how would you like to help Papa Samuel and Mama look for that treasure?" The boy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? We're really going to dig for treasure?" "We're really going to dig for treasure," Samuel confirmed, hoping he wasn't about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The afternoon that followed would either be remembered as the day the Crawford family found their fortune, or the day they lost their home, trying to chase an impossible dream. Either way, Samuel thought as he headed for the tool shed to gather picks and shovels, it was better than spending the rest of his life wondering what might have been buried beneath their feet. The pickaxe struck the floorboard with a crack that echoed through the bedroom like a gunshot, sending Daniel scrambling backward into his mother's arms as wood splinters flew in all directions. Samuel wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the December cold seeping through the walls, his muscles aching from 2 hours of careful demolition under the watchful eyes of federal marshals and estate lawyers who treated this desperate gamble like afternoon entertainment. "Easy there, Samuel," Marshal Davidson cautioned from his position near the door. "We need to preserve any evidence of previous digging, not destroy it." 3 floorboards lay stacked against the wall, revealing packed earth beneath that showed clear signs of disturbance. Someone had definitely dug here before the soil was softer than it should be after years of settling, and Samuel could see the faint outline of what might once have been a rectangular hole. Sheriff Hawkins knelt beside the excavation, running his fingers through the loose dirt. "This earth's been turned within the last few years. See how it's different from the packed clay underneath." Constance stood in the corner with Daniel, her face pale but determined. The bedroom that had been their private sanctuary now resembled a construction site, with furniture pushed against the walls and mud tracked across what remained of the floor. Samuel could see the worry in her eyes, not just about whether they'd find anything, but about what would happen to their family if this wild scheme failed. "Papa Samuel," Daniel whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "what if the treasure is really big, like a whole box of gold coins?" One of the lawyers chuckled, but Samuel noticed Marshal Davidson studying the boy with interest. "Son," the marshal said gently, "has anyone ever told you stories about what might be buried here?" Daniel nodded eagerly. "Friedrich Weber said his papa thinks there's enough gold to buy a whole town, and that the man who buried it drew a map so he could find it again. But then he disappeared in a blizzard, and nobody ever saw him again." The adults exchanged glances. Klaus Weber had clearly been sharing more details with his son than he'd revealed to Samuel, and children had a way of remembering the dramatic parts of stories that adults often forgot or dismissed. "Friedrich mention anything else?" Sheriff Hawkins asked casually. "He said, the treasure man marked his hiding place with a special stone that looked like a star," Daniel replied. "But I don't see any starstones in here." Samuel paused in his digging, something nagging at the back of his memory. The previous owner had mentioned finding unusual stone markers on the property, but Samuel had assumed they were just boundary markers or surveying points. What if they served a different purpose entirely? "Constance," he said suddenly, "remember that oddly shaped rock near the well? The one you said looked like it didn't belong there?" Understanding dawned in her eyes. "The one with the strange markings carved into it?" I always thought it was just decorative, but if you look at it from the right angle, it could look like a star," Samuel finished. Marshal Davidson stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. "Gentlemen, I think we need to expand our investigation beyond this room." The next hour was spent in controlled chaos as the official party tramped through the snow to examine every unusual stone on the Crawford property. Daniel proved surprisingly helpful, his child's eye for patterns, noticing details the adults had overlooked. It was he who spotted the second star-shaped stone half buried near the barn, and who suggested that maybe the stones were supposed to point towards something rather than mark it directly. "Look," he said, arranging his wooden blocks on the kitchen table in the same pattern as the stones they'd found. "If you draw lines between them, they all point to the same place." Samuel studied his stepson's makeshift map, comparing it to Johann Brenner's hand-drawn chart. The boy was right. The stones formed a rough triangle with all lines pointing toward a spot about 50 yards behind the house, near where the prairie grass grew taller and thicker than anywhere else on the property. "That's where the old root cellar used to be," Constance said suddenly. "I noticed the depression when I first started living here, but it was so overgrown, I assumed it had collapsed years ago." Marshal Davidson nodded approvingly. "Mrs. Crawford, would you be willing to show us this location?" The trek through knee-deep snow tested everyone's determination. But when they reached the spot Constance had described, even the skeptical lawyers had to admit that something unusual had happened here. The depression was roughly rectangular, about 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, filled with prairie grass that grew differently than the surrounding vegetation. "Someone definitely dug here," Sheriff Hawkins observed, probing the ground with a long stick. "And not too long ago, either. This grass hasn't had time to establish deep roots." Samuel began digging again, this time with an audience that included his entire family and half the territorial government. The work went faster in the open air, and within 20 minutes, his shovel struck something that definitely wasn't dirt. The sound was metallic, hollow, like striking a bell buried in the earth. "Stop," Marshal Davidson ordered. "From this point on, everything needs to be documented officially." What they uncovered over the next hour would be talked about in Nebraska territory for years to come. The metal object turned out to be an iron strongbox, approximately 2 feet square, and secured with a lock that had long since rusted beyond function. It took 3 men to lift it from the hole, and even then, it required considerable effort. "Heavy enough to be interesting," one of the lawyers muttered. The lock yielded to Samuel's hammer after several careful strikes, and the lid opened with a screech of protesting hinges. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected them from moisture and time, were bundles that made everyone present catch their breath. Gold coins, lots of them. But more than that, there were official documents, land certificates, and what appeared to be mining claims from California dating back to the 1850s. Someone had buried not just money, but an entire fortune in legal claims that might still be valid. Marshal Davidson whistled low under his breath. "Gentlemen, I think we're looking at the personal effects of someone who struck it very rich in the California gold fields and then tried to bring his fortune east." "Why would he bury it here?" Constance asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because," Samuel said, studying one of the documents, "according to this mining claim, the man who buried this treasure was named William Crawford. Same last name as mine." The revelation hit the group like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just any random treasure, it was a family legacy that had been waiting decades for the right Crawford to claim it. "Could be a coincidence," one of the lawyers said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Could be," Marshal Davidson agreed, "but it's one hell of a coincidence. And it certainly explains why Johann Brenner was so convinced this particular piece of land held something valuable." As afternoon faded toward evening, the legal implications of the discovery became clear. The treasure provided undeniable proof that Samuel had made substantial improvements to the property through his discovery efforts. More importantly, if William Crawford was indeed related to Samuel, the family connection might supersede all other claims to the land. "Mr. Crawford," Marshal Davidson said as they prepared to return to the house. I think it's safe to say that your family's residence on this property is no longer in question. Samuel looked at the strongbox that had just changed his family's entire future. Then at Constance and Daniel standing beside him in the snow. 3 months ago, he'd been a failed prospector with $47. Now, he was a landowner with more money than he'd ever dreamed of possessing. But as they walked back toward the warm lights of home, Samuel realized that the real treasure had never been buried in the ground at all. The golden light of Christmas morning streamed through windows that no longer looked out on an uncertain future, and Samuel Crawford stood in his kitchen, watching his wife teach their son how to count the coins that had transformed them from desperate homesteaders into one of the wealthiest families in Nebraska territory. 2 days had passed since the discovery, and the reality of their changed circumstances was still sinking in like snow melting into rich soil. 27, 28, 29. Daniel counted carefully, his small fingers separating gold eagles into neat stacks on the table. Mama, how much money is this really? Constance smiled, her green eyes holding a piece Samuel had never seen there before. Enough to fix our roof, buy proper winter clothes, and maybe even add that room we talked about for your baby sister. Baby sister? Daniel looked up with the wide-eyed curiosity of a child processing important news. Are we going to have a baby sister? Samuel felt his heart skip as Constance blushed, her hand moving unconsciously to her still flat stomach. They'd only been married a month, but the signs had been there for anyone observant enough to notice the way she turned green at the smell of coffee, how tired she'd been getting lately, the careful way she'd been moving around the house. We might, Constance said softly, her eyes meeting Samuel's across the room. It's still too early to be certain, but Samuel crossed the room in 3 quick strides, gathering both his wife and stepson into his arms. The family he'd never expected to have was growing, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt capable of providing the security and love they deserve. When? He asked, his voice thick with emotion. Late summer, if I'm right about the timing, Constance replied. August, maybe September. Daniel wriggled free from the embrace, his mind already racing ahead to the practical implications of the news. Will the baby sleep in my room? Can I teach him how to catch frogs in the creek? What if it's a girl? Do girls like frogs? Samuel laughed, remembering his own childhood confusion about the differences between boys and girls. Girls like lots of things, Daniel. We'll just have to wait and see what this baby enjoys. A knock at the door interrupted their family moment. Through the front window, Samuel could see Klaus Weber approaching with his familiar, purposeful stride. But today the German farmer's weathered face was split by the biggest grin Samuel had ever seen. My friend, Klaus called out as Samuel opened the door. I hear congratulations are in order, not just for the treasure, but for other happy news as well. Samuel shook his head in amazement. How does word travel so fast around here? Anna saw Constance in town yesterday buying fabric for baby clothes. Klaus replied with a wink. My wife has an eye for these things. The morning that followed was filled with visitors, neighbors who'd heard about the treasure discovery and wanted to offer congratulations. Sheriff Hawkins stopping by to finalize the legal paperwork. Even Pastor Mueller arriving with a basket of fresh bread and the news that the congregation was planning a celebration dinner in honor of the Crawford family's good fortune. But it was the last visitor of the day who brought the most surprising news. Marshal Davidson arrived just as the winter sun was setting, carrying a leather portfolio that looked official enough to contain important documents. Samuel invited him in for coffee, noting that the federal officer seemed unusually excited about something. Mr. Crawford, the marshal began without preamble, we've been investigating the background of that treasure you found, and the results are quite remarkable. Samuel settled into his chair, Constance beside him with Daniel on her lap. The strongbox sat on the kitchen table, its contents now carefully catalogued and documented by territorial authorities. William Crawford, the man who buried that gold, was indeed your relative, Marshall Davidson continued. Your great-uncle, to be precise. He left Missouri for the California gold fields in 1851, struck it rich, and started back east in 1854 with enough money to buy half of Nebraska territory. What happened to him? Constance asked. According to records we found in Denver, he made it as far as this location before winter set in earlier than expected. Local Pawnee traders reported finding an abandoned wagon about 10 miles north of here, but no body was ever recovered. Samuel studied the marshal's face, sensing there was more to the story. Why are you telling us this? Marshall Davidson smiled. Because William Crawford filed a will in Denver before starting his journey home. In it, he left his entire fortune to any member of the Crawford family who might follow in his footsteps and claim the land he'd chosen for the family homestead. The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. You mean he intended for family members to find this place? More than that, the marshal replied, pulling documents from his portfolio. He actually filed a claim on this entire section of land, 160 acres under territorial homestead laws. The claim was never processed because he disappeared, but it's still legally valid. Constance gripped Samuel's hand tightly. What does that mean for us? It means, Marshall Davidson said with satisfaction, that the Crawford family has owned this land legally since 1854. Johann Brenner never had legitimate title to sell. Jeremiah Mosley's transactions were all fraudulent, and you, Mr. Crawford, are the rightful heir to both the land and everything your great-uncle buried on it. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire, and Daniel's quiet counting as he continued organizing gold coins into neat piles. Samuel felt tears, threatening not of sadness, but of overwhelming gratitude for the twists of fate that had brought him to this moment. There's one more thing, Marshall Davidson added, his voice carrying a note of amusement. William Crawford's will includes a provision that any Crawford who claims the inheritance must establish a proper family homestead where future generations can prosper. Given your recent marriage and the Dardis prospect of children, I'd say you fulfilled that requirement admirably. As the marshal prepared to leave, he turned back with a final observation. Mr. Crawford, your great-uncle was clearly a man who understood that the best treasures aren't always made of gold. He built provisions into his will that would ensure this land went to someone who valued family and hard work over quick profit. After Marshall Davidson left, Samuel stood on his front porch, looking out at the snow-covered prairie that now belonged to his family forever. Behind him, warm light spilled from windows where his pregnant wife was putting their son to bed, their voices mixing with the domestic sounds of home. The treasure they'd found would provide security for generations. But Samuel knew that the real fortune was the family they'd built together. From desperate strangers sharing a house out of necessity, they'd become something neither had dared to hope for, a true family bound by love, trust, and the shared conviction that they could face whatever challenges the future might bring. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and decisions about how to use their unexpected wealth. But tonight, Samuel Crawford was simply a man grateful for the gifts that mattered most. A wife who'd chosen to trust him, a son who called him Papa, and a child yet to be born who would grow up knowing the security of belonging to a family that would never abandon each other. The Nebraska wind still carried the scent of snow across the endless prairie. But now, it also carried the promise of spring, new life, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones that find you when you're brave enough to open your heart to unexpected grace. The sound of hammering echoed across the Nebraska prairie on a crisp April morning in 1868, as Samuel Crawford stood on the roof of his expanding house, nailing shingles that would protect his growing family from the storms of another winter. 5 months had passed since Christmas, and the treasure's discovery had transformed not just their financial situation, but their entire approach to building a life on the frontier. Below him, Constance worked in the vegetable garden that now stretched twice as far as the original plot, her pregnancy showing clearly beneath the new dress Samuel had ordered from the catalog in Omaha. Daniel chased chickens around the yard, laughing as the birds squawked and fluttered away from his enthusiastic pursuit. The scene looked like something from a picture book about happy families, but Samuel knew that prosperity brought its own challenges. "Samuel!" Klaus Weber's voice called from the road. "You have visitors coming." Samuel looked up from his work to see a group of riders approaching, not the threatening kind that had once meant trouble, but well-dressed people who moved with the confidence of those accustomed to getting what they wanted. 3 men and a woman, all mounted on expensive horses and wearing clothes that cost more than most farmers made in a year. "Constance," Samuel called down, "take Daniel inside for a bit." His wife looked up from her garden, immediately understanding the caution in his voice. Prosperity had brought many visitors over the past month, some legitimate, some not. Word of the Crawford treasure had spread far beyond Nebraska territory, attracting everyone from distant relatives, claiming family connections to confidence, men with elaborate schemes for investing their newfound wealth. The lead rider dismounted with practiced ease, removing his hat to reveal silver hair and the kind of smooth face that suggested a life spent in boardrooms rather than prairie winds. "Mr. Crawford? I'm Jonathan Whitfield, from the Territorial Development Company in Omaha. We'd like to discuss a business proposition with you." Samuel climbed down from the roof, noting how the other 3 visitors remained mounted, a subtle show of authority that suggested they expected this conversation to be brief and one-sided. The woman, elegantly dressed in riding clothes that probably cost more than his house, studied the property with calculating eyes. "What kind of proposition?" Samuel asked, not offering to shake hands or invite them inside. Whitfield smiled, the kind of expression Samuel had learned to distrust from his dealings with men like Jeremiah Mosley. "We represent a consortium of investors interested in developing this region for railroad access and commercial agriculture. Your property sits at a strategic location that would be perfect for a rail depot and grain elevator complex." "My property isn't for sale," Samuel replied flatly. "Oh, but Mr. Crawford," the woman spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "We're not here to buy your land. We're here to offer you a partnership that could make you one of the wealthiest men in the territory." Samuel felt his jaw tighten. "I'm listening." Whitfield pulled a rolled document from his saddlebag, spreading it on the makeshift table Samuel had built for outdoor projects. It was a detailed map showing railroad lines, proposed development sites, and profit projections that made Samuel's treasure discovery look like pocket change. "The railroad is coming through this area within 2 years, Whitfield explained, pointing to red lines that crossed directly through Samuel's property. "When it does, this sleepy farming community will become a major transportation hub. Land values will increase by 1,000%, almost overnight." "And you want what from me?" Samuel asked, though he was beginning to understand the true purpose of this visit. The woman leaned forward in her saddle. "We want you to sell us development rights to your property while maintaining ownership of your house and immediate grounds. You keep your home, we build the infrastructure, and we split the profits from commercial development." It sounded reasonable on the surface, but Samuel had learned enough about business dealings to recognize when someone was offering him fool's gold instead of the real thing. "What's the catch?" Whitfield's smile faltered slightly. "No catch, Mr. Crawford. Simply a mutually beneficial arrangement between partners. Partners who remain mounted while making their pitch." Samuel observed. "Partners who show up without advance notice expecting immediate decisions. Partners who think a farmer who found one treasure is stupid enough to give away the next one." The atmosphere grew noticeably cooler. One of the mounted men shifted his horse closer, his hand resting casually on the butt of a holstered pistol. Samuel noted the movement without appearing to, his own hand moving to the hammer he'd been using for roofing work. "Mr. Crawford," the woman said with forced patience, "I think you misunderstand the nature of progress. The railroad is coming whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether you profit from the development or get swept aside by it. Is that a threat?" "It's reality," Whitfield replied coldly. We're offering you the chance to be part of something bigger than a small family farm. But if you prefer to stand in the way of progress, he didn't finish the sentence. But Samuel understood the implication. These people weren't just business partners. They were the advance guard of forces that could destroy everything he'd built if he didn't play by their rules. I need time to think about it, Samuel said finally. Of course, Whitfield replied, rolling up his map. But don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't wait for indecision. As the visitors prepared to leave, the woman looked directly at Samuel, with eyes that reminded him of winter ice. Mr. Crawford, I hope you understand that some decisions have consequences that extend far beyond personal preference. Your family's welfare might depend on making the right choice. After they rode away, Samuel stood in his yard, feeling like a man who'd just been visited by vultures. The morning's peaceful domesticity had been shattered by the reminder that wealth attracted predators, just as surely as carrion drew scavengers. Klaus Weber approached from across the field, his weathered face showing concern. Those people looked like trouble, my friend. They were, Samuel confirmed. The kind of trouble that comes with money and power and the belief that both give them the right to take whatever they want. What did they want? Samuel explained the development proposal while Klaus listened with the grim attention of a man who'd seen similar schemes destroy farming communities in other territories. When Samuel finished, the German farmer shook his head slowly. I have seen this before. In Colorado Territory, Klaus said, these development companies, they promise partnership but deliver slavery. They get their hooks into your land and soon you work for them instead of yourself. But what if they're right about the railroad? Samuel asked. What if development is coming whether we want it or not? Klaus studied the horizon where the visitors had disappeared. Then we better make sure it comes on our terms, not theirs. That evening, as Constance prepared dinner and Daniel played with the wooden train set Samuel had bought him in town, the family discussed their options around the kitchen table that had become the center of their decision-making process. They scared me, Constance admitted, as she served stew made from vegetables from their own garden and beef from Klaus Weber's cattle. Not just what they said, but how they said it, like they expected you to be grateful for whatever they offered. Samuel nodded, cutting meat for Daniel, while thinking about the woman's parting words about consequences extending to his family's welfare. The question is whether we fight them or try to work with them. Can't we just ignore them? Daniel asked with the simplicity of a child who believed problems disappeared if you didn't pay attention to them. Sometimes ignoring problems makes them bigger, Samuel explained gently. But sometimes fighting them head-on isn't the smartest approach either. Constance placed her hand over her growing belly, the gesture reminding Samuel that they weren't just making decisions for themselves anymore. The baby she carried would inherit whatever world they created through their choices. What would your great-uncle William have done? She asked suddenly. Samuel considered the question seriously. William Crawford had been a man who'd risked everything on the possibility of finding gold in California, then risked it all again, bringing his fortune home to build something permanent for his family. He'd been a gambler, but a smart one who understood that some risks were worth taking and others were traps disguised as opportunities. I think, Samuel said slowly, he would have found a way to turn the situation to his advantage without giving up control of his own destiny. Outside, spring rain began falling on the roof Samuel had been repairing, the sound reminding him that some storms were weather and others were human-made. Either way, a man had to be prepared to protect what mattered most. The sound of baby Margaret's first cry filled the Crawford house on August 15th, 1868, announcing the arrival of a daughter who would grow up knowing security and love in equal measure. Samuel stood outside the bedroom door, pacing like an expectant father should, while the midwife Anna Weber worked with quiet competence to bring his child safely into the world. It's a girl! Anna called through the door, her voice carrying the satisfaction of a woman who'd helped deliver dozens of babies across the frontier. And she's got a healthy set of lungs on her. Samuel's knees nearly gave out from relief. 5 months had passed since the visit from the development company. 5 months of careful planning and quiet preparation for what everyone knew was coming. But today, all of that faded into insignificance beside the miracle of new life. "Can I see them?" Samuel asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Give us a few minutes to get everyone cleaned up," Anna replied. "Then you can meet your daughter properly." Daniel bounced excitedly beside his stepfather, having been relegated to the kitchen during the birthing process. "Is she really my sister now? Can I teach her to catch frogs when she gets bigger?" Samuel laughed, remembering his own questions about babies when he was Daniel's age. "She's really your sister, and I'm sure she'll love learning about frogs from her big brother." When Anna finally opened the bedroom door, Samuel entered to find Constance propped up against pillows, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets they'd sewn from fabric bought with treasure gold. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with wisps of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right through him. "Samuel," Constance whispered. "Meet Margaret Crawford." Samuel approached slowly, awed by the perfection of this small person, who carried his name and his hopes for the future. When Constance placed the baby in his arms, he felt something shift inside his chest, a fierce protectiveness that made every previous feeling pale in comparison. "She's beautiful," he managed to say, though words seemed inadequate for the moment. "She's ours," Constance replied, and those two words contained more meaning than any elaborate declaration of love. The peaceful domesticity of the afternoon was interrupted by the arrival of Klaus Weber, who burst through the front door with news that couldn't wait for proper visiting etiquette. "Samuel," he called urgently. "They're back. The development people, they're in town with surveyors and legal papers." Samuel carefully handed Margaret back to her mother, his mind immediately shifting from new father to protector of his family's interests. "How many?" "A dozen, maybe more," Klaus replied breathlessly. "And they've got sheriff's deputies with them, not our Sheriff Hawkins, but men from the territorial capital." The implications were clear. Jonathan Whitfield and his associates had decided that Samuel's refusal to cooperate required more direct intervention. They were moving to force the issue through legal channels that might not recognize the rights of individual landowners against corporate interests. "What's their legal basis?" Samuel asked, checking his revolver and gathering the documents that proved his ownership of the property. "They're claiming right of eminent domain for railroad construction," Klaus explained. "Say the territorial government has authorized them to acquire necessary land for transportation infrastructure." Samuel felt ice forming in his stomach. Eminent domain was a legal doctrine that allowed governments to seize private property for public good, usually with compensation, but not always with the owner's consent. If Whitfield's company had managed to get territorial backing for their development scheme, individual property rights might not be enough to stop them. "Samuel," Constance called from the bedroom, her voice steady despite having given birth just hours earlier. "Whatever you're planning to do, remember that you have a family to come home to." He turned back to look at his wife holding their newborn daughter, with Daniel standing protectively beside the bed. Everything he'd fought for, everything that mattered, was contained in that room. The treasure they'd found had given them financial security, but it was these relationships that made life worth living. "I'll be careful," he promised, "but I won't let them take what belongs to our children." The ride to town with Klaus took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Samuel's mind raced through the legal options available to him, weighing the advice Marshall Davidson had given him months earlier about the importance of documentation and official witnesses. If this was going to be a legal battle, he needed to make sure he had all the ammunition the law could provide. Main Street bustled with more activity than Samuel had ever seen, as if the entire territorial government had decided to hold a convention in their small farming community. Surveyors' equipment lined the boardwalk. Official-looking men in expensive suits clustered around maps and documents, and uniformed deputies stood guard with the casual authority of those accustomed to enforcing unpopular decisions. At the center of it all stood Jonathan Whitfield, directing operations with the confidence of a man who believed victory was inevitable. When he spotted Samuel approaching, his smile held more satisfaction than friendliness. "Mr. Crawford," Whitfield called out. "Perfect timing. We were just about to visit your property to begin the preliminary surveying work." "On whose authority?" Samuel demanded, dismounting and approaching the group with Klaus close behind. Whitfield produced a thick document bearing official seals and signatures. Territorial Governor's Office. Emergency authorization for railroad development in designated strategic corridors. Samuel studied the paperwork, noting the impressive legal language that seemed designed to intimidate rather than inform. But years of dealing with mining claims and railroad contracts had taught him to look for the details that mattered most. "This authorization is for survey work only," he observed, "not for land seizure or development rights." "Survey work is the first step," Whitfield replied smoothly. "Once we've established the optimal route for the railroad, formal acquisition proceedings will follow. And if the landowners refuse to sell?" Whitfield's smile turned cold. "Then the territorial government will exercise eminent domain authority for the public good. I'm sure you understand that individual preferences can't be allowed to obstruct progress that benefits the entire territory." Samuel felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had sustained him through years of watching powerful men take advantage of those who had less. But this time, he wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for the future his children would inherit. "Mr. Whitfield," Samuel said quietly, "I think there's something you need to understand about this particular piece of land." "What's that?" Samuel pulled his own documents from his coat pocket. Not just the treasure discovery papers, but the territorial land grants, the family inheritance claims, and most importantly, the federal homestead patents that established his property rights under national rather than territorial law. "This land is held under federal homestead authority," Samuel explained, his voice carrying across the street to the growing crowd of interested observers. "That means territorial eminent domain doesn't apply unless the federal government specifically authorizes it." Whitfield's confidence flickered for the first time. "I'm sure any legal technicalities can be resolved through proper channels." "I'm sure they can," Samuel agreed. "Especially when those proper channels include a federal marshal who's already documented this property as a legitimate family inheritance with strategic value to national transportation development." The lie came smoothly, based on just enough truth to be believable. Marshal Davidson had indeed documented the treasure discovery and family inheritance, and he'd mentioned the potential importance of the region for future railroad development. Samuel was gambling that Whitfield wouldn't risk a confrontation with federal authorities without being absolutely certain of his legal ground. "Furthermore," Samuel continued, pressing his advantage, "any attempt to seize this property without proper federal authorization would constitute an illegal taking under territorial law, subject to both criminal prosecution and civil damages." The crowd that had gathered was now openly listening to the confrontation, including several local farmers who had their own concerns about development companies seizing private land. Samuel could see understanding dawning on their faces. If the Crawford property could be taken without proper legal authority, none of their farms were safe. Whitfield looked around at the hostile faces surrounding him, clearly recognizing that the situation had shifted from a private business negotiation to a public confrontation with political implications. "Mr. Crawford, I think you're overestimating your legal protections." "Maybe," Samuel replied, "but I'm willing to let federal courts decide that question. Are you?" The standoff stretched for several tense moments before Whitfield made his decision. "We'll be back with proper authorization," he said finally. "This isn't over." "No," Samuel agreed, watching as the development company packed up their equipment and prepared to leave. "It's not over, but it's not going the way you expected either." As the outsiders rode away, Samuel stood in the middle of Main Street, surrounded by neighbors who'd seen a small farmer face down corporate power and territorial authority. He'd won this battle, but he knew the war was far from finished. The ride home took him past fields where other farming families worked their own land, Tending crops and raising children who deserved the same security Samuel was fighting to preserve for his own family. By the time he reached his house, Samuel understood that this confrontation had been about more than just one family's property rights. It had been about the kind of future they wanted to build on the Nebraska prairie, one where families like his could prosper through hard work and determination, or one where distant corporations decided how the land would be used and who would benefit from its development. Inside, Constance was nursing baby Margaret, while Daniel played quietly nearby, the domestic scene providing a stark contrast to the legal and political battles Samuel had been fighting. But as he looked at his family, his wife, his son, his daughter, Samuel realized that these quiet moments of peace were exactly what made all the fighting worthwhile. The Nebraska wind still carried the scent of prairie grass across the endless plains, but now it also carried the promise that some things were worth defending, no matter what powerful forces might challenge them. Samuel Crawford had learned that the greatest treasure wasn't gold buried in the ground, but the family and community that grew when people were willing to stand together against those who would take away their right to build their own futures. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to the simple joy of holding his daughter and knowing that she would grow up on land that belonged to her family forever.